Please be seated. We had a retreat yesterday in which, for those of you who were there, this certain card was passed out. And yesterday's retreat had to do with the whole subject of forgiveness. Now, I want to read at least, and this will only take a moment, part of this card so that you can remember what was presented yesterday. And for those of you who weren't there, so that you can hear for the first time what was presented yesterday as part of our preparation for the Vespers of Forgiveness tonight, because today is the Sunday of forgiveness. And I want you to catch something out of that retreat. In fact, I spoke with the lady who led the retreat and told her what I was going to do today, and she thought, good idea. Now, the card said some aspects of forgiveness, and I'm only going to read one part of it. Forgiveness. What is it? Forgiveness is the willingness to abandon one's right to resentment, negative judgment, and indifferent behavior toward one who unjustly injured us, while fostering the undeserved qualities of compassion, generosity, and even love toward him. Quite a mouthful, right? The willingness to abandon one's right to resentment, negative judgment, and indifferent behavior. 2, to forgive is to overcome resentment and anger in the wake of an offense and to reframe the offender as a person capable of doing better in the future. In other words, rather than looking at that person for the rest of your life as some evil person, you change your attitude toward them and you reframe the offender as a person capable of doing better. In other words, you expect them to change. 3, when unjustly hurt by another, we forgive when we let go of the resentment we have toward the other, not by denying our right to the resentment, but instead by trying to offer the wrongdoer compassion, benevolence, and love. We give up not by denying our right to resentment, but instead by offering the wrongdoer compassion, benevolence, and love. In other words, you don't minimize what happened, but you still offer them compassion, benevolence, and love. And 4, forgiveness involves a change of heart toward the wrongdoer in which the forgiving person relinquishes any emotion of hatred or resentment toward the wrongdoer. Change of heart toward the wrongdoer, in which the forgiving person relinquishes any emotion of hatred or resentment toward the wrongdoer. Now, I will tell you as a priest that you'd be surprised how often somebody comes to confession and says to me the opposite of that. Father, I don't see how I can forgive that person. Father, I don't see how it's possible for me to just put out of my mind. By the way, by put out of my mind, they don't mean forget. They would settle for putting out of the mind, meaning that whenever they think of the person, the anger does not rise in their hearts. How hard it is for me to put out of their mind what happened to me. Father, I don't know what I can do. I don't think I can do this. Now, I'm going to suggest something to you today, and that is that most of you have already done these steps multiple times as you have lived the years of your life, and you may not realize it. And what I want to do today is take you back to a time, by the way, which is still today, from when you were young to now, and of the many times that you have done exactly what it says in these 4 steps and maybe not even realize it. You have abandoned your right to resentment. You have overcome resentment and anger. You have forgiven, you have let go of the resentment, and you have changed your heart toward the one who offended you. And some of you are going, when did I do all those things? When did I learn to put all those things aside? Well, there was a comic that was published between 1985 and 1995. In fact, I have a a photocopy of one of the panels from that comic that became very famous during that time, and it was it was written by Bill Watterson, and most of you who are my age or even some younger will know about Calvin and Hobbes. Calvin and Hobbes was a comic about a boy who had a stuffed tiger named Hobbes who mysteriously came to life whenever there was no one around him. But really, a lot of what Calvin was about and Hobbes was about was this little boy and his incredible imagination, but also his incredible passion or incredible ways that he could get people angry with him, to put it frankly, and there's no other shorter way to put it. One of the comics that was published, because I don't want to go on, you should look up Calvin and Hobbes. It was very famous in its time. Bill Watterson is still alive and is a strong practicing Christian. And so he would periodically slip in little Christian things into the drawings that he put, and this was one of them. Calvin had these long-suffering parents who had to put up with all his shenanigans and all the weird stuff that he did. In this case, the first panel shows a mother in bed waking up suddenly, listening to the cry, "Mom, wake up, come quick." She answers, "What's wrong? What's the matter?" You know, it's a cry that every mother does not want to hear in the middle of the night. Second panel, and the heading on it is 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7. And she says by the boy's bedside, "Yes, Calvin?" And he says, "Mom, is it true what Paul said about how love endures all things?" The third panel, the mom is answering him and says, "I think so, because it's the only thing keeping me from strangling you right now. Now go back to sleep." In the fourth panel, he's back in bed, the lights are off, and he's mumbling, "I bet Paul wouldn't have said that." Did you catch the dynamic of what happened there? And although it's a comic, it actually covers most of the points, doesn't it? Here's the mother. She is woken up in the middle of the night, and she comments that it's only the love that she has for him that keeps her from strangling him. My wife and I have 3 daughters that have all grown up and have kids. So far, 2 of the 3 daughters have children that have either become teenagers or are preteens. Both those daughters have already sent us texts saying, "Mom and Dad, I apologize for all the things that I did when I was a teenager." Can you hear the repentance and realization? You see, here's what most of us don't realize. All of us grew up in some type of family. Now, some of you are saying, "Well, wait a minute, mine wasn't a full family." Believe me, I understand. My mother managed to outlive 2 dads, okay? So I have lived both under dad and under single mom. We were political refugees. I've lived in an orphanage. I've lived in a foster home. Guess what? They were all families, but of different types. And in every one of them, the grace of the Lord was present there to bring change and to slowly teach me how to love and how to forgive. For those of you who had brothers and sisters, don't tell me there weren't times when you wanted to kill your brother or sister. We had 3 daughters. What do you mean you borrowed my skirt without telling me? Any of you ladies have sisters, and wasn't that one of the lines you sometimes use? "How dare you go into my stuff and touch it?" But guess what happened? with rare exceptions, I am betting that you have a reasonably good relationship with your sibling. If you're a boy, particularly if you're old enough to know the days when boys were actually allowed to fight, you may have even fought against your brother, or even today you've been in a wrestle match that your parents had to stop, and yet now as you have grown up, your brother is a person you look forward to seeing. Now, are there exceptions? Yes, of course there are. Frankly, there are exceptions. You know, there are families when things went so badly wrong and dysfunctional that relationships are badly broken, and I understand that. But in the vast majority of families, what we learned as we were growing up and what we learned as we were parents was how to do all those steps that were passed out yesterday. Now, I will tell you that when I first got married, I never thought that sometime in my life, and I'm old enough to come from a time when Pampers were a little bit too expensive for us to buy, that I would be taking a cloth diaper full of nasty stuff and with my hands dipping it in the toilet to clean it out enough so that we dared put it in a washing machine. I will guarantee you no boy ever thinks he's going to be doing that. And so in a family, what we learn is service. Service even under difficult circumstances. And we learn to see each other through eyes of love that won't quit. Those of you who have already raised children understand what I mean by eyes of love that won't quit. Remember, I talked about the two daughters that have already sent apologies because looking back, they know how they behaved. But the funny thing was, when we got the apology, we didn't have this sense of, oh, now I can relax because I can give up my anger. We had no anger. For us, it was a funny text. We had long ago given up any anger or resentment for what may have happened during their teenage years simply because our eyes were fixed on loving them even when we were ready to kill them. And by the way, parents, don't tell me there weren't times when you wondered if your child was a changeling and you needed to give him back to somebody else. Or you wondered if the orphanage was open. And yet, those eyes of love through which we see our children, through which we see our brothers and sisters, were the eyes that filtered things so that we understood that the relationship we had with them was so important that we were willing to set aside all our rights to resentment for the things that were done to us by them. Now again, I realize there are some extreme cases, and please understand if you had a family that was one of the really extremely dysfunctional ones, I understand. But for most families, what I said was true. So now how do you take that and apply that to those around you? Well, there's a funny thing. Have you ever, this is the South, been around church people and have somebody say, well, hello, Brother George. Hello, Sister Martha. It comes from the biblical idea that we are the body of Christ, that we are family, that we are brothers and sisters, that because we have been adopted by the same Father in heaven, we have a relationship with one another that ties us together as family. Sometimes when we have trouble forgiving, it's because we have trouble seeing that relationship. We don't see the person as our brother or sister, not biological, but by adoption. And so we don't see them through the same eyes of love that we see those who are our physical relatives. When we're called to forgiveness, particularly of those within the church, we're called to see them with the same eyes that we see our mother and father, the same eyes with which we see our brother and sister who are of the flesh. We're called to see each one of you that way. Because the only way I'm going to be able to give up resentment and anger towards something that might have been done to me by one of you, and no, I'm not complaining, I'm just saying, is if I really see you honestly as my brother and my sister. Only when I look at you with those eyes of love, the eyes of family love, can I have any hope of giving up the resentment, the anger, and all that stops me from forgiving someone. Now, I didn't say that forgiveness would always be easy. We had one of our daughters who, at an age of 19, Presbyter and I were, frankly, we were seriously talking about asking her to move out of the house. She just really was misbehaving. She's a wonderful mom right now. I'm going to be visiting her soon. And it took a while to work through all of this. But it wasn't as long as you might think, because ultimately, she was our daughter, and we loved her. Ultimately, somehow, we were going to stay in relationship with her because we loved her. That's the same attitude we need to have one toward another as we approach this Sunday of forgiveness, that we look at each other with the same eyes to which we look at our fathers and our mothers and sisters and brothers and say, I don't care what it takes. Somehow, even if I have to work it through, I'm going to love them in such a way that I can give up my resentment and my anger. Again, let me repeat, I understand there are some extreme cases where it becomes significantly more difficult. I understand that. But for the vast majority of us, most of what we hold against one another, if we really think it through, is stuff that if one of our relatives did to us, we would find a way to work it through and forgive them. If you latch onto that, if you latch on to the many ways in which when you were younger, you slowly learned to forgive as you argued with your brothers and sisters, as you argued with your parents, as your children argued with you, as your grandchildren argued with you, and somehow through it all, you're still family and you love one another. If you can capture that, you can forgive almost anybody for almost anything. Because guess what? You have been doing it all along. And that is what you're called to today in the Sunday of Forgiveness. Be family and to forgive one another as family. So tonight when you come ready to forgive and come ready to be family. Father,